The sun was slowly sinking behind the red rocks of the desert, painting the sky in colors of orange, pink, and gold. The wind moved gently through the dry grass, carrying with it the sound of quiet footsteps. In this wide open land, silence often spoke louder than words. The young Apache girl walked slowly, her hands loosely tied with a rough rope. She was tired but stood straight, her eyes sharp and alive. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, tangled from the wind and the long journey. She had lived her whole life under the desert sun. The land was a part of her, and she was a part of it. But on this evening, everything felt different. The men leading her were settlers who lived near the ranch. They spoke in low voices, sometimes glancing back at her. Their boots made soft thuds against the dry earth. None of them seemed proud of what they were doing. It wasn't a celebration. It was something heavy, something no one wanted to talk about. As they walked, the girl looked up at the colors of the sky. She remembered how as a child she would watch the same sky with her little brother. They would imagine stories in the clouds, seeing shapes of horses and birds. That memory came to her now like a warm light in a cold room. Far ahead, a wooden fence marked the edge of a large ranch. The land belonged to a quiet man named John Turner. He was known in the nearby town for living alone. He had worked that land for many years, raising horses and cattle, keeping mostly to himself. People called him the rancher, though he had once been many other things: a soldier, a husband, and a man who had seen more than he ever spoke about. John stood near the fence, watching as the small group approached. His face was calm, but inside something stirred. He wasn't a man who liked surprises, and this was not something he had asked for. He could see the girl from a distance, small, thin, with eyes that seemed far too old for her age. "John," one of the men called out as they drew closer, "we brought her here. We need you to take care of it." The words hung in the air like a stone dropped into a still pond. No one said what "take care of it" really meant. They didn't need to. The silence was enough. John didn't speak. He simply nodded slowly, though his mind was already spinning. He had spent years trying to stay away from trouble, to keep his ranch peaceful and quiet. He didn't want to be part of anyone's quarrel. But now standing before him was something different. This wasn't a storm he could just ride out. The girl stopped walking when they reached the fence. She lifted her chin and looked directly at John. For a long time, no one spoke. The air between them was full of things unsaid. He saw in her eyes not fear, but a kind of strength that surprised him. She was young, but her gaze was steady. John had seen that look before, many years ago when he was a soldier far from home. He had seen people facing something they didn't choose, something bigger than themselves. And he remembered, too, what it felt like to be powerless. "Go on," one of the men said behind him a little too quickly. "You're the one who can handle it." John slowly stepped forward. The ground crunched beneath his boots. The girl didn't move back. She stood still, her breathing calm, though her hands trembled slightly. When he was close enough, he could see the dust on her cheeks, the tiredness in her shoulders. "Do you understand me?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Do you know why they brought you here?" Again she nodded. Her lips parted just a little, and she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear. "I beg you, just make it quick." The world seemed to freeze at those words. The wind stopped. The men behind him grew quiet. John's heart gave a single hard beat. He had expected tears, maybe fear, maybe silence. But not this. He stared at her, and for a moment he wasn't standing on his ranch. He was back years ago in another place, holding a uniform that no longer fit him, standing in front of another young face that carried the same look of tired courage. He remembered the way the world could take someone's youth and turn it into silence. The girl's voice wasn't angry. It wasn't broken. It was the voice of someone who had accepted something she should never have had to accept. And that broke something inside him, not in a loud way, but like a quiet crack in a strong wall. The men shifted nervously. One of them whispered, "Come on, John, don't make this harder." But John didn't move. His hands were still at his sides. He looked at the girl again, and he noticed the small things, the way the rope was tied too tightly around her wrists, the way her hair fell into her face, the way her chin lifted as if daring the world to see her as more than a burden. She was a person. A child, really. Someone's daughter. Someone who had laughed once, played once, dreamed once. And here she was in the middle of a dusty ranch, trusting a stranger to decide her fate. John took a slow breath. He had built his life out here to escape choices like this. But sometimes the choices you run from find their way back to you. He took another step forward. She didn't flinch. The men behind him grew impatient, their whispers growing louder. But he wasn't listening to them anymore. He remembered his late wife, Mary. She had a gentle way of seeing the good in people, even when the world tried to hide it. You can choose, she used to tell him when things were hard. Even when it seems like you can't, there's always a choice. He hadn't thought of her in a long time, but now her voice was clear in his memory. The sun had almost dipped below the horizon now. A soft orange light fell across the land, turning the moment into something strange and timeless. John lifted his eyes again and met hers. She held his gaze without blinking. In that moment, it felt like they understood each other without speaking. She didn't ask for kindness. She didn't expect mercy, but she was still human, standing in front of him with quiet strength. His hand twitched at his side, not out of fear, but from the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her. It was about who he would be after this night. The men were still talking in the background, trying to rush him, but their voices sounded far away. All John could hear was his own heartbeat and the wind moving slowly through the dry grass. He realized that he couldn't do what they expected. Something deep in him refused to be part of a world that forgot how to see people as people. He took another slow step closer, close enough to see the faint scratches on her wrists from the rope. She was tired, yes, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. She whispered something under her breath, so soft he almost didn't hear it. A word in her own language. He didn't know what it meant, but he understood the feeling behind it. The sky had turned from orange to deep purple now. The stars were beginning to appear, small and quiet. It was the kind of night that seemed to hold secrets. John lowered his eyes for a brief moment, then looked up again. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how the others would react. But he did know one thing. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. The girl stood still, waiting, not knowing what his choice would be. She didn't cry. She didn't speak again. She simply stood with quiet dignity, as if she belonged to the land itself. And John Turner, the rancher who had spent years avoiding the world, felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Courage. The kind of courage that doesn't come with loud speeches or grand actions. The kind that begins with a single decision. A quiet one. The men behind him grew restless. "John," one said sharply, "it's getting dark." But he didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the girl. In that fading light, two strangers, one a rancher, one a young girl, stood facing each other, caught in a moment that would change both of their lives. The wind brushed gently against their faces. The land, the sky, the stars, all of it seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what John Turner would do next. The wind grew softer as night fell over the land. The sky above the ranch was now a deep blue, with stars slowly appearing one by one. A quiet stillness covered everything, like the world itself was waiting to hear the next sound. John Turner stood there facing the girl, feeling the weight of his decision pressing on his chest. Behind him, the men began whispering again. They didn't understand why he hadn't done what they expected. To them, the girl was just a problem to be removed, a name they would forget by sunrise. But to John, in this one moment, she was a human being standing in front of him, full of life and fear and courage. John's hand slowly reached toward the rifle at his side. The men thought he was finally doing what they wanted. But instead, he carefully placed it down on the ground, the wooden handle resting softly on the dust. That single movement was quiet, but it spoke louder than words. The men fell silent. One of them took a step forward, confused. "John," he said in a low voice, "what are you doing?" John didn't answer. He walked closer to the girl until they were only a few feet apart. Her breathing was steady, her eyes locked on his. She didn't understand what was happening, but something in his calmness made her stand tall. He kneeled down slowly and looked at the rough rope tied around her wrists. The knots were tight, almost cutting into her skin. For a brief second, his hands hesitated. If he untied her, everything would change. His quiet, predictable life would no longer be quiet. But then he remembered something his late wife once told him. Doing the right thing isn't always easy, but if it were, everyone would do it. Without another thought, he began to loosen the knot. The rope felt dry and stiff in his hands, but he kept going until it fell softly to the ground. The girl didn't move right away. She just stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise. The men behind him were no longer whispering, they were shouting. "What are you doing?" One man yelled. "Have you lost your mind?" Another demanded, but John didn't turn around. He kept his voice calm and firm. "She's no danger to us," he said. "She's a child." The girl touched her wrists gently, feeling the air on her skin again. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She just stood there, not sure if this was real. One of the men tried to step forward, but John straightened his back and faced them. He wasn't a loud man, but there was something about the way he stood now, solid, steady, that made them stop. "I said she's not a threat," he repeated. "This is my land. My say." They stared at him, shocked. John Turner had never gone against them before. He had always stayed quiet, never picking sides, never making trouble. But tonight he wasn't the quiet rancher anymore. He was a man who had drawn a line in the sand and everyone could see it. The air was tense. It felt like the whole desert was holding its breath. Finally, one of the men shook his head and spat on the ground. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "Maybe," John said softly, "but I'll live with it." One by one, the men turned and walked away, their footsteps fading into the distance. The wind returned, brushing against the grass like nothing had happened. John turned back to the girl. She was still standing there, her face lit by the soft glow of the stars. "Come with me," he said gently. "You can't stay here. It's not safe." She followed him quietly as he led her toward the back of the ranch. His horses stirred softly in their stalls as they passed. He gave her a wool blanket, a small canteen of water, and a piece of bread from his kitchen. She held them carefully, almost as if she couldn't believe someone was helping her. They didn't speak much. There was no need for many words. He pointed toward the hills in the distance, the dark outline of the land she called home. She understood what he meant. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps crunching softly on the dirt path. The moonlight painted their shadows long and thin across the ground. Finally, she looked at him and whispered, "Why?" John stopped walking. He looked at the hills, then at her. "Because you're a person," he said simply, "and I couldn't pretend you weren't." Her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name, relief, confusion, maybe a quiet kind of hope. She nodded slowly. As they reached the edge of his land, John stopped. "You'll be safe once you cross the ridge," he said. "Keep going until you see the river. Follow it east. It'll take you home." The girl wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. For a moment she didn't move. She just stood there staring at him as if trying to memorize his face. Then, in a soft, almost shy voice, she said a single word in her language. He didn't understand it, but the way she said it made something warm settle in his chest. She turned and started walking toward the hills, her figure slowly becoming smaller under the moonlight. She didn't look back, at least not right away. But just before she reached the ridge, she stopped. She turned around, her dark hair moving gently with the wind, and met his eyes one last time. For a brief second they stood there, silent and still. Two strangers who had met by chance but would remember each other forever. Then she disappeared into the night. John stood alone at the edge of the ranch for a long time. The wind wrapped around him like an old friend. His life had changed in the quietest of ways. The next morning the sun rose over the desert, bright and gold. John went about his chores as usual, feeding the horses, checking the fences, walking the land. But everything felt different now. When he went into town later that week, he could feel the stares. People whispered. Some turned away. Some shook their heads. But he didn't lower his eyes. He walked with a steady step, not explaining himself to anyone. He didn't need to. That night, when he returned home, he sat on the porch listening to the night sounds. For the first time in a long time, his heart felt quiet. Not the quiet of loneliness, but the quiet of peace. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers in town faded, as whispers often do. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm, but John was not the same man. Something had shifted deep inside him. He had made a choice that cost him nothing but meant everything. Sometimes on cool evenings he would stand at the edge of the ranch and look toward the hills. He never saw her again, but he liked to imagine she was safe living her life, remembering that one night under the stars when a stranger chose kindness. Years later, people would still talk about John Turner, the quiet rancher. Some said he was foolish. Others said he was brave. But no one really knew what happened that night except for him and the girl. John never told the story, not because he was ashamed, but because it didn't belong to him alone. It was shared between two souls who had crossed paths for just a moment, yet changed each other forever. In the desert, stories often live longer than people. The wind carries them across the land, from ridge to ridge, from campfire to campfire, and somewhere out there, maybe that girl told the story too. Not of fear, but of a man who saw her as a person when others didn't. John grew older. His hair turned silver, his hands rough from years of work. But whenever the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned to gold, he remembered that evening. The quiet sky, the steady eyes of a young girl, the rope falling softly to the ground. It wasn't a loud moment. There were no grand speeches, no crowds, no headlines. Just a single choice made in silence, and sometimes that's all it takes to change a life.